start off this morning by just acknowledging the moms again. I know that a lot of why I am who I am today is because of the example of my mom. I've been blessed with an incredible mom. For those of you guys that know her, she's amazing. She's sitting in the back row, so I got to give her a little bit of shout out this morning. So let's just give a hand to all the moms again really quick. If there is a mom that's sitting close to you, if you are a mom, hug a mom that's near you. Like show some love in here today. See some of you guys, I like it. Even if they're not your mom, but you know they're a mom, go ahead and hug them. That can be a little weird, but you know we're about that here. This morning I want to start off with this story, and this story is either going to confirm that I'm crazy in your eyes, or you might think that I'm a genius. So either way, like it could go one way or the other. So the way that KCU kind of handles things, I went to Kentucky Christian University, and in deciding to go there, I did not go there because the booming metropolis of Grayson was an incredible town. I went there, well, I can't really tell you why I went there. I just chose that school for whatever reason, and I ended up at KCU. And so there wasn't a lot to do. So when I moved in welcome weekend, I got to know some people in town, and they said, hey, we do this thing called cliff jumping. And it sounded really, really cool. I was like, man, that sounds great. Now, for those of you guys that don't know what that is, it's where you run off of a perfectly solid foundation, and you jump into water that you probably can't see more than a foot down into, so you don't really know what you're jumping into, but you do it anyway. Kind of crazy, again. So for welcome weekend, we had gone to Grayson Lake several times, and we had been off of small cliffs, like 20, 30, 40 feet, like nothing crazy, nothing that was going to like shatter our legs or anything like that. So like it was 30% probability that we could have got hurt. So it wasn't a huge risk, and I say that now like after I've graduated and I've moved on. And so my parents just get these confessions every time they come and hear me speak. But we did that, and it was fun. It was a good time. It was something to do during the fall. And so we're sitting in our room one day, probably playing video games when we should have been doing homework. But I'm sitting with a group of friends, and this guy that we'd hung out with a couple of times from town, he comes running in, and he says, guys, I've got it. I know what we're going to do today. And we're like, okay, what, man? And he said, I heard about this 90-foot cliff up at Grayson Lake that we need to go and we need to jump off this thing. And like we kind of looked at him like with that look, like, are you serious? Like 90 feet, that's really high. And he's like, yeah, we're going to go do it. And so there really wasn't a whole lot of debate. Before we knew it, we were in the cars, we were driving out to Grayson Lake and getting ready to go and jump off of this cliff. And so we park, we start walking through the woods, and it felt like it took forever to get there. Maybe it was just because I was going through this inner dialogue within my mind of, man, am I crazy? Yeah, I'm definitely crazy. This is insane. Like, there have been people that have died jumping off this rock, and we're getting ready to jump off this rock. This is crazy. But I didn't like verbalize that to the people that were around me, because if I did, man, there was a good chance I was going to lose my man card, and I did not want to be that guy. And so we're walking up, and I just remember the feeling in my stomach, like just this. I'm scared of heights just a little bit, not like a lot. Like I'm not petrified, like standing up on the stage, like I can look over and I'm good. But this is 90 feet we're talking about. And so we get up there, and it's the spot, and this dude whose idea it was just ran and jumped off the cliff. And I'm just thinking, like, he didn't even look over the edge. Like, he didn't look down, nothing. Like, just ran and jumped. And I'm like, this is where he dies. But, eventually we hear the splash, and he yells up, and he's like, guys, it's awesome, come on in. And like one after another, my friends just jump off this rock. And then it's down to me and this other guy. And I don't know, again, intelligent maybe, I don't know. So we're having this conversation. This guy looks at me and he says, well, I'll jump if you do. Guys, you know what that means. That's like a triple dog dare. Like if you don't jump off of this rock, not only are you responsible for you not jumping off the rock and catch the hazing that's going to come from that, you're also going to get hazed because of the other guy that didn't jump off the rock that put it on you. And so I'm just like, oh man, yeah, I'm gonna jump. And so like I'm just kind of doing the thing, getting ready, and I take off and I jump off this rock, and I'm just thinking, as I'm falling, like, this is it. Like, this is where it ends. But I hit the water. My feet felt like they just split, man, because when you smack water from 90 feet, like, that's really, really high. And I go under the water, and I come out, and I just remember thinking, man, that was awesome. I'm never going to do it again, but that was incredible. And so my friends and I, we leave. Nobody jumped off of it again. Once was enough. Now, this morning, we're talking about this idea of influence and tying it into legacy. And I think with the legacy that we leave, it's directly impacted by the influence that we have on other people. Now, in this circumstance with my friends, there was this truth that I came to, and it's you're going to be an influence on somebody, whether that influence is good or bad. Now, in that time with my friends, when we were getting ready to jump off this rock, the dude whose idea it was to come in there and talk to us, he was the influencer in that situation. Now, looking back, I may lean more towards it being a good influence because we lived. But if somebody had gotten hurt, I mean, honestly, like that's kind of crazy to think about. Now, no matter where you are in your walk of life, there's always somebody who's observing you. Now, if you're a parent, that's your kids. Your kids see how you interact with your husband, your wife, or your significant other. They see how you talk to each other. So they see the things that you do. If you're constantly on your phone when you're with them, they see that. If you go your separate ways after dinner, they see that. Like our kids, they're like sponges. They see what we do, and they just kind of soak all that stuff up. And chances are the things that they see in us are going to impact their future relationships down the road because we are an influence on our kids. If you're in the workplace and whatever job you have, you are influencing your coworkers. If you come in a bad mood, it could be a negative influence on them. As a teacher, and this thought haunts my dreams, I have 150 kids that come in and out of my room every year. And they stay for the next 4 years, and they may still come in and out of my room even if they don't have me in class. I'm an influence on those students. And it's to the point that by the end of the year, if I come in and I have a different facial expression than I normally have, I have kids that are asking me if I'm having a bad day. The influence that I have on those students is something that I can't take lightly. And it happens everywhere, in the office. If you're standing in the line of the self-checkout and there's somebody with 75 items in front of you going through the self-check, you guys know the frustration. But in that moment, there are people around you, and your influence and your impact and how you're reacting in that situation speaks volumes of who you are and the influence that you have. Now, I think there's this tendency, and you guys might do this on a daily basis when we're watching the news or we're reading the newspaper or we're scrolling through our Facebook feed, of looking at the world in which we live and saying things like, I've never seen it this bad. Kids aren't like they used to be. The world is a really dark place. And there's this tendency for us to get into that moment and to feel like we can't do anything. Like we think, like, what am I supposed to do in that situation? We may have a little tug on our heart to do something, but we don't have the legs behind it to go out, or the courage to go out and to do something about it. Well, as I was preparing for this message, and I was talking to Kevin about it, he brought up this point, and it's a really interesting point. He said, if you look at the beginning of creation, and you read through Genesis 1 and the account there, when God is done creating everything in the world, he looks at it and he says that it was good. So in the beginning, when the world was created and man was created and everything was finished, God looked at it and saw that it was good. So in order for it to be this bad place that we oftentimes see it as, somebody had to influence it that way. And if somebody could influence it for the bad, can you imagine if we joined together as a group of Christ followers and just kind of linked arms to reach out into the community, what kind of a good influence we could be and how we could change the world? See, there's this truth that oftentimes gets overlooked. As a Christ follower, when you commit to following after Christ, you have the Spirit of God living inside of you. I'm going to say that again. You have the Spirit of God living within you. We were created in the image of God. And so we're not powerless to do something. That Spirit that's living inside of us should give us confidence in doing things for our community and being the positive influence that we know we are called to be. And sure, it's easy to sit back on the couch and just say, man, the world is a mess and there's nothing that I can do about it. But guys, the image of God is not destroyed because you're still here. I'm still here. And while we're still here, because we're still here, we have a responsibility and an obligation as a follower of Christ to influence our world for good. We're called to do that. Now, there's this quote, and Jesus is probably the most influential person to ever live. And I'm going to have to read this thing because it was just so long. But I found this quote, and it says this. It says, "No life ever lived on this planet has been so influential in the affairs of men like the life of Jesus Christ. From that brief life and its apparent frustration has flowed a more powerful force for the triumphant waging of man's battle than any other ever known by the human race. By it, millions have been lifted from illiteracy and ignorance and have been placed upon the road of growing intellectual freedom and control over the physical environment. It has done more to allay the physical ills of disease and famine than any other impulse known to man. It's emancipated millions from slavery and millions of others from addiction. It has protected tens of millions in exploitation by their fellows. It's been the most fruitful source of movement to lessen the horrors of war and to put the relations of men and nations on the basis of justice and peace. I think a lot of times we look at the example of Christ and we think about the God that we serve and we think, man, there's no way that I'm ever going to be that person, and you'd be right in thinking that. Because we have a small piece of God living within us that can give us the confidence and the desire to reach out, and the truth remains, we are going to be an influence, whether that influence is good or whether that influence is bad. Now this morning we're going to take a look at this small section of Scripture, and it comes in this part of Matthew called the Sermon on the Mount. Now this sermon, and why it's called the Sermon on the Mount, is because Jesus had such a large following that just kind of went with him wherever he went. I mean, these people heard the things that he did, and they heard the things that he said, and he was so countercultural that they wanted a piece of whatever it was that Jesus had. And so they just kind of followed after him from town to town, place to place. And he had such a large following that if he were just to stand there and talk to them like I'm talking to you, there's no way that his message would have been heard amongst all the people. And so Jesus kind of goes up on this mountain, and he understands that this is an opportunity to share on so many topics, on so many things that these people would be facing throughout their lives. And so he touches on things like jealousy and lust and divorce and all kinds of other things within this sermon. But at the beginning of this sermon, he touches on the idea of influence. And we're going to look at this section of Scripture that's probably familiar to you, but something that we maybe haven't thought about it in the way that I'm going to share. And it says this. This is in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. It says, "You are the salt of the earth. But what good is salt if it's lost its flavor? Can you make it salty again? It will be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless." Now, the people of Jesus' day would have understood what he was trying to get at with this metaphor. They didn't have refrigerators. They didn't have deep freezes. So the only way that they could preserve their meat was by putting salt into it to preserve it. And so Jesus, in this example, what he's doing is he's comparing the world to rotting meat. It sounds really disgusting when you think about it, but if you were to flip on the TV and watch the news, sometimes maybe Jesus isn't too far off. And so what he's saying is, this isn't a request. Notice the way that he says that first little section. He says, "You are the salt of the earth." He doesn't say, "Hey, could you please be salt? If you have time, would you be salt?" No, he says you are. It's not a request. This is more of a command. You are the salt of the earth. And what Jesus is calling us to do is to reach out into the community, to go into our community and to be what preserves what he created, to be the people that we are called to be. We're supposed to be rubbing elbows with the people in our community who are unchurched. It's easy to sit within the walls and to be around people who are like-minded, but it's another thing to go forward and to be God's hands and to be God's feet and to do the things that he's called us to do. So in being salt, we're supposed to be reaching out, because when you are preserving meat, you don't just sprinkle a little salt on top. You work it in there. You got to put it into the meat to preserve it. So he says, "You are salt." And the passage continues in verse 14. It says, "You are the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father." Now again, just like the first example, this is not a request. He says, "You are light." I think a lot of times that, we have a little bit of a misunderstanding of what darkness really is. Darkness isn't really a thing. If you were to look at it scientifically, what darkness is darkness is the absence of light. So when we watch the news, when we read the Facebook feed, when we look through Twitter and we see these things and we start thinking in our mind, man, the world is a dark place, what we're acknowledging is the fact that God isn't in the world. Where are the Christians in that sequence? Where are we? When we acknowledge that the world is dark, we are acknowledging the fact that there is no light. And so Jesus calls us in verse 14 to be light. to shine, to be different, to stand out like a city on a hill. Guys, to be the joy in people's lives who are struggling, who are going through a tough time. We're called to be that. We're not supposed to sit back and say, oh, I hope somebody does something about that. If there's a tugging on your heart and God puts it within your soul to do something, chances are you're the person that's supposed to do it. Now, within these two viewpoints, there's this survivalist mentality. Now, survival says, but if I'm going out and if I am trying to be salt, if I'm trying to be light, what if I lose my saltiness? What if my light starts to fade? Now, I've not been on the earth for that long, but I know enough to know that we could ask the what ifs from now until the point that we're on our deathbed. And we can sit there and we can think and we can overanalyze and we can go through all these situations of what might happen if we start reaching out. But guys, that's not what God has called us to do. What God has called us to do is to thrive, not just to survive. John 10:10 says, a thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy, but I have come so that you may have life and have it to the full. And I firmly believe that our influence speaks volumes of whether or not we're living that out. Do we really believe that God can do something with us? Do we really believe that God wants us to have a full life? It's huge. So our legacy is dependent upon the influence that we've had on people, the people we've come in contact with. You guys have probably heard the saying that people forget what you say, they forget what you do, but they never forget the way that you make them feel. I think the way that we make people feel is through our influence. Now, it breaks my heart that people think this way, but sometimes we get in this zone where we just think that there's no possible way that God could use me. And maybe you, in those moments, you're considering things that you've done in your past. You're considering things that you've been through, and you think there's no way that God could use someone like me. But the experiences that we've had in our lives have been there to shape us into who we are today, to make us aware of our gifts and our talents and our abilities and the way that God has molded us. Those experiences that you've been through to maybe help somebody who's going to go through the same thing. The fact that you're out on the other side shows who you are. And so it's heartbreaking to hear people that get into that zone where you feel like you can't make a difference, guys, because all of us can. Now, to kind of wind this thing down, I want to go through two questions that kind of came to my mind as I was finishing this thing out. The first one was this, is who needs light? Being aware of the people around us is something that we're maybe not as aware of all the time because we're focused on what we're supposed to be doing. But guys, there are people around us who need the light that we have inside. There are people around us who need the joy that we have in our hearts. Maybe it's that coworker that comes in every day and always seems to be in a bad mood. You guys know who I'm talking about. Maybe they need a little bit of the joy that you have. Maybe it's somebody that you know of that's struggling and you've heard their struggle and you know that there's a way that you can meet them in that struggle. Maybe it's stepping up and doing that, being that person for them. So who around me needs light? Who needs the joy that I have in my heart? And the second question is who am I an example to? And I shared at the beginning that we all have people that are observing us and watching us.